31 of the finest doctors in the country stood inside a private intensive care suite, and not one of them could explain why the woman in the bed was dying. Every test contradicted the last. Every treatment failed. The chief executive of a billion-dollar empire was slipping away under fluorescent lights, while the most decorated physicians in the state argued in circles. Then a black man in a wrinkled flannel shirt, a single father who had wandered up from the pediatric ward, stepped forward and said 7 words that silenced the room. "I know what's killing her." They laughed. They should not have. How could a maintenance worker with no white coat see what 31 specialists could not? And what would it cost him to make them listen before it was too late? Before we begin, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments. The children's ward at St. Albans Private Hospital smelled like antiseptic and apple juice. Dennis Hill sat on the edge of a narrow cot, his daughter's small hand curled around his index finger. Mia was 7. She had her mother's wide brown eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, and right now both were softened by sleep. The sickle cell crisis had hit 3 days ago, the worst one yet. Her hemoglobin had dropped to 5.8, and for 11 hours Dennis had watched the nurses cycle in and out with transfusion bags, while his daughter shivered under a thin hospital blanket. He had not left her side except to use the bathroom. His phone had 17 missed calls from his supervisor at the building where he worked maintenance. He would deal with that later, or he would not. There was no version of the world where Dennis Hill left this room, while his daughter still had a line in her arm. He reached over and adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. On the nightstand sat a worn copy of an old children's book about a girl and a yellow brick road, its spine cracked from years of bedtime readings. Mia always asked for the same chapter, the one where the girl realizes she had the power to go home all along. Dennis never told her why that chapter made his throat tighten. Vanessa would have known what to say right now. Vanessa always knew what to say, but Vanessa had been dead for 5 years, killed by a tumor no one had thought to look for. 2 floors above the pediatric ward, in the wing that most hospital staff had never set foot in, a controlled chaos was unfolding. Linda Grant, 58 years old, chief executive of Grant Graves Industries, ranked among the most powerful women in business, had been airlifted in 9 hours earlier after collapsing during a board meeting. The reports were alarming but vague. Blood pressure spiking to 240/130, then crashing to 80/50 within minutes. Heart rate swinging wildly between 40 and 160. Profuse sweating. A headache so severe she had vomited before losing consciousness. The suite looked less like a hospital room and more like a luxury hotel that happened to have medical equipment, marble floors. A sitting area with leather chairs, a window overlooking downtown. None of it mattered now. Linda lay in the center of it all, intubated, sedated, her skin the color of old paper, monitors screaming numbers that made no sense to anyone watching. Her husband, Richard Grant, stood by the window with his arms crossed and his tie loosened. He had not spoken in 2 hours. Beside him, Linda's chief of staff, a sharp woman named Claire Dawson, was on her 4th phone call with the company's board. The stock had already dipped on rumors that something was wrong with the chief executive. If Linda died, the number would be far worse. The hospital's chief medical officer, Dr. James Alcott, had made the calls personally. Within 6 hours, 31 specialists had assembled. Cardiologists, neurologists, endocrinologists, infectious disease experts, kidney specialists, toxicologists. They came from 3 different states. 2 of them had literally stepped off planes. And they could not figure out what was killing her. Dr. Robert Price, head of cardiology, was convinced it was a cardiac event, a hypertensive emergency complicated by an underlying arrhythmia. Linda's blood pressure stabilized for 20 minutes on his protocol, then crashed again, worse than before. Dr. Ann Lester from neurology argued for a stroke, possibly masked by the cardiac symptoms. A scan showed nothing. A second scan showed a spinal tap came back clean. Dr. William Chambers, the infectious disease specialist, raised the possibility of sepsis from an unknown source. Blood cultures were drawn. Broad-spectrum antibiotics were started. Linda did not improve. By the 8th hour, the specialists had fractured into camps. 3 separate whiteboards had been rolled into the adjacent conference room, each covered in competing theories and conflicting timelines. Voices were rising, egos were colliding. Dr. Harrison Wells, the senior attending and the hospital's most published physician, had taken unofficial command of the room, dismissing theories with the confidence of a man who had never been wrong in his life. He was leaning toward a rare autoimmune condition, but could not explain why Linda's stress hormone markers were behaving so erratically. No one could explain anything. That was the problem. Meanwhile, Linda's kidneys were beginning to fail. Dennis first heard about the patient upstairs from a nurse named Dolores. She had come to check Mia's line around 11 at night and mentioned casually that the whole hospital was in an uproar. Some rich woman upstairs was dying and nobody could figure out why. Dennis had nodded politely and said nothing. It was after midnight when Mia woke up crying. The pain was back, a deep grinding ache in her bones that the medication could only dull, never erase. Dennis held her, rocking gently, humming a song Vanessa used to sing until the crying softened into whimpers and the whimpers faded into sleep. Then he eased her back onto the pillow and stepped into the hallway to find a nurse. The pediatric ward was quiet. The nurse's station was empty. A shift change, maybe. Or an emergency somewhere else. Dennis walked further down the corridor, turned left, then right, following the signs toward what he thought was another station. He did not realize he had crossed into the private wing until the floor changed from linoleum to something soft. The conference room door was open, not wide, just enough for sound to escape. Dennis heard the voices before he saw the faces. A dozen men and women in white coats talking over each other, throwing around terms most people would not recognize. Dennis recognized every single one. Blood pressure surges recurring every 40 to 90 minutes. Racing heart resistant to standard medication. Kidney function declining. Drenching sweats correlating with the pressure spikes. Dennis stopped walking. His hand found the wall and he leaned against it, suddenly unsteady. The fluorescent light above him buzzed. His mouth went dry. His heart began to pound in a way that had nothing to do with being somewhere he should not be. He had heard these exact words before, not in this hospital, not from these doctors. 5 years ago in a county hospital on the other side of the city. A younger version of Dennis had stood in a hallway just like this one, listening to a different group of doctors list the same symptoms for a different woman, his wife, his Vanessa, surges of blood pressure, racing heart, drenching sweats, headaches that made her scream, kidneys failing for no apparent reason. And doctors, good doctors, smart doctors, running in circles because the tumor that was killing her was the diagnosis nobody thought of until it was too late. Vanessa had died on a Tuesday. Dennis had spent every night for the next 2 years reading everything ever published about the tumor that killed her. Not because he planned to go back to medical school. He had abandoned that dream when Mia needed a full-time father. He read because the knowledge was the only thing that made the grief bearable. If he could understand exactly what had gone wrong, maybe the randomness of it would hurt less. It never hurt less. But the knowledge stayed. Now, standing in the hallway of St. Albans' private wing just before 1 a.m, Dennis heard the ghost of his wife's illness speaking through the symptoms of a woman he had never met, and he knew, with the certainty of someone who had earned his understanding through the worst kind of tuition, exactly what was happening inside that room. He also knew that if he walked away, there was a very good chance Linda Grant would die the same way Vanessa had. Dennis stood there a long time, his hands trembling. Every rational part of his brain told him to turn around, go back to Mia, stay in his lane. He was a maintenance worker, a single dad, a black man standing uninvited in the most expensive wing of a hospital that had never been designed for people like him. But Vanessa's face was right there behind his eyes and it would not leave. He pushed the door open. The room held 14 people, a fraction of the full 31, the rest monitoring from adjacent rooms or reviewing scans remotely. They all turned. 14 pairs of eyes landed on Dennis, his faded flannel shirt, his worn jeans. His work boots still flecked with paint from a job 3 weeks ago. He looked like he had wandered in from the maintenance closet, which in a sense he had. Dr. Harrison Wells spoke first. "Sir, this is a restricted area. Are you lost?" Dennis looked at the whiteboards, at the lists of symptoms, at the crossed-out diagnoses and the question marks and the arrows pointing nowhere. Then he looked at Dr. Wells. "I think I know what she has." Silence, kind that comes before laughter. It came. A short, incredulous breath from Dr. Price. A smirk from a resident in the corner. Wells tilted his head as though Dennis had told a joke in a language he did not quite speak. "I appreciate the concern," Wells said, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a man accustomed to dismissing people without appearing rude. "But we have the situation under control. If you could step outside, security will escort you back to wherever you need to be." "You don't have it under control," Dennis said. His voice was quiet, steady. "You've been treating her for 9 hours and she's getting worse. I know what this is because I've seen it before." Wells's warmth evaporated. He nodded to someone near the door. Within 30 seconds, a security guard appeared. Dennis felt a hand on his arm. "Sir, you need to come with me." Dennis looked back at the whiteboard one-line on as he was led out. The numbers stared back at him. The answer was right there, written in symptoms that any careful third-year medical student would have caught if they had ever watched someone die from it. The door closed behind him, but Dennis Hill was not done. The guard walked him back to the pediatric ward without a word. At the double doors, separating the private wing from the rest of the hospital, the guard stopped, pointed down the corridor and said, "Stay on this side." Then he turned and left. Dennis went back to Mia. She was still asleep, her breathing shallow but steady, the drip catching the light from the hallway. He lowered himself into the chair beside her bed and pressed his palms against his eyes. His mind would not stop. The symptoms kept cycling through his head like a song he could not turn off. Surges of pressure, racing heart, drenching sweat, all of it pointing to the same answer that had come too late for Vanessa and was running out of time for Linda Grant. Sometime before dawn, Mia stirred and opened her eyes halfway. "Daddy, you're awake," she murmured. "You should sleep." Dennis smoothed the hair off her forehead and told her he would in a minute. She studied him with that particular seriousness she got from her mother, and then she said, "Your worried face is on." He tried to soften it. He had spent 5 years perfecting the art of not letting his daughter see the weight he carried, but she saw it anyway. She always did. "There's a lady upstairs who's sick," he admitted quietly, because he had never been able to lie to her, "and I think I can help her, but nobody will listen to me." Mia considered this the way she considered everything, with total conviction. "You should tell them again," she said, "and use your loud voice." Then she fell back asleep, and Dennis sat there in the dark and understood that a 7-year-old had just given him the only permission he actually needed. Morning came grey and cold through the window. Mia woke around 7, groggy but smiling, and asked for scrambled eggs. Dennis flagged down a nurse, ordered breakfast, and sat on the edge of the cot while she ate. He told her a story about a brave girl who travelled through a magic hospital where the walls changed colour depending on your mood. Mia laughed. It was the best sound in the world. By 8:30, he could not sit still anymore. He told Mia he was going to get coffee and stepped into the corridor. His plan was simple. Find anyone on Linda Grant's medical team who might actually listen. He did not have credentials. He did not have authority. But he had something none of those 31 doctors had, and it was burning a hole through his chest. The first attempt failed before it started. Dennis approached the information desk near the private wing and asked to speak with someone on Mrs. Grant's care team. The receptionist, a young woman with perfect posture and a polite, immovable smile, asked for his name and affiliation. When Dennis said he was a parent from the pediatric ward, her expression shifted into something he recognized immediately. It was the look people gave when they were about to say no, while pretending they were saying something else. "I'm sorry, sir. Only authorized personnel and family members are permitted access to patient information." Dennis tried again at a nurse's station on another floor. Same result, different face, same wall. A male nurse looked him up and down, the flannel shirt, the work boots, and asked if he was looking for the facilities department. It was not cruelty. That was the thing Dennis had learned long ago. Most of the time it was not even conscious. People simply looked at him and made a calculation based on what they saw. And what they saw was a black man in cheap clothes, who obviously did not belong in the expensive part of the building. The calculation happened in less than a second. The conclusion was always the same. He was walking back toward the pediatric ward, frustration tightening his jaw, when a voice behind him said, "You're the one from last night." Dennis turned. A young woman in a white coat stood a few feet away, a tablet tucked under her arm. She was maybe 30, with dark blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, and the kind of tired eyes that came from too many overnight shifts. Her badge read Dr. Sarah Brooks, internal medicine resident. "I saw them escort you out of the conference room," she said. Her tone was not hostile, but it was not warm either. It was careful, the voice of someone gathering information before deciding what to do with it. "You told Dr. Wells you knew what was wrong with the Grant patient." "I do," Dennis said. Dr. Brooks studied him. "Based on what?" she asked. Dennis told her the truth. He told her about Vanessa. Not dramatically, not looking for sympathy, just the facts, laid out the way you lay out a case history. His wife had died 5 years ago from an undiagnosed tumor of the adrenal gland, a pheochromocytoma. The symptoms Linda Grant was presenting were identical, and the beta blocker they had started was not just failing, it was actively making things worse, blocking the heart's beta receptors without addressing the alpha-mediated clamping of the blood vessels, creating a dangerous cycle of pressure surges followed by crashes. That was why Linda's kidneys were failing. She was being whipsawed to death, and the medication they had chosen was accelerating it. When he finished, something had shifted in Dr. Brooks's expression. Not pity, not belief, but the recognition that the man in front of her was not delusional. He might be wrong, but he was not delusional. She was young enough to know she did not know everything, and old enough to recognize that the 31 experts upstairs had not produced a single working answer in nearly 20 hours. She was also a resident, the lowest rung on the ladder, which meant that if she brought Dennis's theory to the attending physicians and it turned out to be nonsense, her career would take a hit she could not afford. And if she brought it and it turned out to be right, some of those attendings would never forgive her for it. "I can't just walk you into the conference room," she said. "Wells would have me removed from the case." Then get me to the husband, Dennis said. He's the one with decision-making authority. If the doctors won't listen, maybe the family will. It took Dr. Brooks 45 minutes. She made 2 phone calls and had 1 quiet conversation in a stairwell with a senior nurse she trusted. At 10 minutes to 10 in the morning, Dennis found himself standing in a small waiting room, face to face with Richard Grant. Richard looked like a man who had not slept in 30 hours, because he had not. His jacket was draped over a chair, his shirt was wrinkled, his eyes were red. Behind him, through a glass partition, Dennis could see the edge of the intensive care suite where Linda lay surrounded by machines. Claire Dawson, the chief of staff, stood beside Richard with her arms folded. She had agreed to this meeting only because Dr. Brooks had framed it carefully. A person with potentially relevant medical insight, nothing more. Claire's expression made it clear she expected a waste of time. Richard looked at Dennis the way a drowning man looks at a piece of driftwood, not with hope, but with a desperate willingness to grab anything that floats. "They tell me you think you know what's wrong with my wife," Richard said. His voice was hoarse. "I don't think," Dennis said. "I know. Your wife has a tumor on one of her adrenal glands. It produces massive amounts of adrenaline, and its cousins in unpredictable surges. That's why her blood pressure spikes without warning and then crashes. That's why her heart rate is erratic. That's why she's sweating through the sheets. Headache, racing heart, drenching sweat. It's the textbook triad, and every single one of her symptoms fits." Richard shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, but in confusion. "If it's that obvious, why haven't 31 doctors figured it out?" "Because it's rare," Dennis said. "Most physicians will go their entire career without seeing a single case, and because this tumor is a mimic, it looks like a cardiac emergency, it looks like a stroke, it looks like sepsis. Every specialist in that room is diagnosing from inside their own field. The cardiologist sees a heart problem. The neurologist sees a brain problem. Nobody is stepping back to see the whole picture, and there's something else." Dennis kept his voice level. "They put her on a beta blocker. In a crisis like this one, giving a beta blocker without first blocking the alpha receptors can cause a catastrophic rebound in blood pressure. It's called unopposed alpha stimulation. It's in every endocrinology textbook, and it is actively making your wife worse right now." The room was silent. Claire Dawson had uncrossed her arms. Richard looked at Dennis for a long time. "Who are you?" "Nobody," Dennis said. "I'm a maintenance worker. I'm a single father. My daughter is downstairs with sickle cell disease, and that's the only reason I'm in this building. But 5 years ago, my wife died of the same thing your wife has right now. The same symptoms, the same misdiagnosis, the same wrong medication. I watched it happen, and I could not stop it. I'm telling you right now, you can stop it, but it has to be today. If she goes another 12 hours on this protocol, her organs will shut down and there will be nothing left to save." Richard turned to Claire. Claire turned to Dr. Brooks, who had been standing by the door. "Is any of this possible?" Richard asked. Dr. Brooks chose her words with precision. "A pheochromocytoma is consistent with the symptom profile. It would explain the treatment resistance, and the danger of beta blockade in an undiagnosed case is well documented. I can't confirm the diagnosis without lab work, specifically the metanephrine and catecholamine levels. But those tests can be run in under 2 hours." Richard stood up. The driftwood had become something solid. "Get me Dr. Wells," he said, "and get those tests ordered. Now." The confrontation happened around 10:30 in the conference room where Dennis had been laughed out 12 hours earlier. This time he had been invited. Dr. Brooks stood beside him. Richard Grant sat at the head of the table. 14 attending physicians lined the walls, and Dr. Harrison Wells sat directly across from Dennis with the expression of a man who had been personally insulted. Wells let Dennis speak for about 90 seconds before cutting him off. "With all due respect to your personal experience, Mr. Hill, this is not a diagnosis by anecdote. We have imaging, lab work, and the collective expertise of 31 board-certified physicians. We are pursuing an autoimmune condition which is supported by the inflammatory markers." Dennis did not flinch. "Her inflammatory markers are elevated because her body has been in a hormone storm for over 20 hours. That's a secondary response, not a primary cause. You're treating the smoke and ignoring the fire." A murmur went through the room. Dr. Price, the cardiologist, leaned forward. "You mentioned unopposed alpha stimulation from the beta blocker. Walk me through that." Dennis did, point by point. He explained how the beta blocker was lowering her heart rate but leaving the alpha-mediated constriction of the blood vessels unchecked, creating a dangerous cycle of pressure surges followed by crashes. He cited the mechanism. He described the pathophysiology. He spoke the way someone speaks when they have read the same material 1,000 times, not with the polish of a lecturer, but with the bone-deep familiarity of a man who had memorized every word because his wife's life had depended on it. When he finished, 3 of the physicians were no longer smiling. Dr. Price was writing something down. Dr. Wells was not. "This is a waste of time," Wells said flatly. He turned to Richard. "Mr. Grant, I strongly advise against diverting resources based on the speculation of an unqualified individual." Dr. Brooks stepped forward. "The metaphrine test takes 90 minutes. If the results are normal, we have lost nothing. If they are elevated, we have our diagnosis, and we may still have time to savor. The risk of running the test is 0. Risk of not running it." She let the sentence hang. Richard Grant looked at Dr. Wells, then at Dennis, then at the glass wall behind which his wife lay dying by degrees. "Run the test," Richard said. "Now." The results came back a little after 12:15. The metanephrines were elevated at more than 8 times the upper limit of normal. The free catecholamines were through the roof. The diagnosis was confirmed. Pheochromocytoma. Dennis Hill had been right. Every specialist in the room had been wrong. Dr. Wells said nothing. The protocol was changed immediately. The beta blocker was discontinued and replaced with an alpha blocker to be established before any beta blockade. The endocrinology team, which had been consulted only peripherally until now, took over primary management. For 2 hours, Linda's vitals held. Then, shortly after 2 in the afternoon, everything fell apart. Her blood pressure dropped to 65/38. Her heart rate became erratic, jumping, stalling, jumping again. The monitors began screaming, nurses rushed in. Dr. Wells pushed past Dennis in the hallway, shouting orders. The alpha blocker had opened the floodgates. Linda's vascular system, constricted for well over 20 hours by the hormone storm, was suddenly relaxing, and her blood volume was not enough to fill the expanded space. She was crashing. Dr. Wells wheeled on Dennis in the corridor, his face white with fury. "This is what happens when you let amateurs practice medicine. She was stable before you intervened." Richard Grant appeared in the doorway of the suite. He looked at the monitors, at the doctors scrambling, at his wife's body convulsing under the hands of a crash team. Then he looked at Dennis. His eyes asked the question his mouth could not form. "What have you done?" Dennis stood in the middle of it all, the alarms, the shouting, the accusation in every pair of eyes, and felt the ground beneath him disappear, because he had seen this before too. He had watched Vanessa's numbers spiral downward on a screen just like this one. He had stood in a hallway, just like this one, powerless, while the woman he loved slipped away. The difference was that this time he knew what came next, and he knew what had to be done if anyone would let him speak. Dennis raised his voice above the alarms. "Do not switch her back." Dr. Wells was already barking orders at the nursing team to restart the beta blocker. He did not even look at Dennis. 2 nurses were moving toward the line. The crash cart had been wheeled to the bedside. Linda's blood pressure was still falling, 60/34 now, and every person in the room was operating on the same instinct. Undo the last thing that was changed. Dennis stepped forward, close enough that Wells could not ignore him. "This is not a drug reaction, this is expected. Her vascular system has been clamped down by hormones for well over 20 hours. The alpha blocker is releasing that constriction, and her blood volume is not sufficient to fill the expanded vessels. She needs aggressive fluid resuscitation, normal saline, wide open, right now. If you put her back on the beta blocker, you will trap her in the same cycle that's been destroying her organs since she arrived. She will die tonight." Wells turned on him with barely contained rage. "You are not a physician. You have no license, no credentials, and no authority in this room. If this woman dies because of your amateur diagnosis, I will personally ensure you face criminal charges." "If she dies because you restarted that drug," Dennis said, "it won't be my diagnosis that killed her. It'll be your pride." The room went still. Even the nurses had stopped moving, their hands frozen between 2 sets of contradictory orders. The monitors continued, their frantic beeping. Linda's heart rate was jumping between 50 and 120, each spike triggering a fresh cascade of alarms. Dr. Sarah Brooks stepped into the space between Dennis and Wells. She held her tablet up so both men could see the screen. "Dr. Wells, the literature on starting an alpha blocker in an acute crisis specifically warns about a sharp drop in blood pressure in the first few hours. The standard of care is volume expansion, aggressive fluid infusion, not discontinuation of the alpha blockade. Reverting to beta blocker alone in a confirmed case with catecholamines at 8 times normal would be contraindicated by every major endocrinology guideline published in the last 15 years. She was not raising her voice. She did not need to. Every word landed with the weight of someone who knew she was risking her residency and had decided to risk it anyway. Wells stared at her, his jaw working. Behind him, Dr. Price, the cardiologist, was looking at the monitor with an expression that had shifted from panic to something more calculated. He had been writing notes during Dennis's presentation that morning. He had not thrown them away. "She's right about the fluid resuscitation," Price said quietly. "If this is constriction releasing volume, is the answer not more fluid, not reversal?" Richard Grant stood in the doorway. He had watched the entire exchange without moving. His wife's blood pressure read 58/32 on the screen above her bed. The number was dropping. Time was a luxury no one in the room could afford. Richard looked at Dennis. His voice came out barely above a whisper, rough and cracking at the edges. "Your wife, she went through this too." Dennis met his eyes. She did, and the doctors did exactly what Dr. Wells is about to do. They panicked and reversed course. She was dead by morning. Richard closed his eyes. When he opened them, he was looking at the nurses. "Do what he says. Fluids. Keep the current medication. Do it now." Wells opened his mouth to protest. Richard cut him off with a single look, the look of a man who had nothing left to lose and was done asking permission. The nurses moved. 2 liters of normal saline went up on a pressure bag running wide open into Linda's central line. A third was spiked and ready. Dr. Brooks positioned herself at the bedside monitor, watching every number, her pen tapping against the tablet in a rhythm she did not seem to notice. Dennis stood by the wall. He had done everything he could do. The rest belonged to Linda's body, to the blood flowing through her veins, to the vessels slowly learning to relax after a day of chemical siege, to the kidneys that had been battered but had not yet quit. The minutes stretched 5, 10, 15. Linda's blood pressure drifted between 55 and 62, too low, dangerously low, but no longer falling. Her heart rate settled into the 90s, still fast but no longer chaotic. The alarms continued, but the pitch of the room had changed. The frantic energy had given way to something heavier and quieter, the weight of waiting. At the 20-minute mark, the top number climbed to 68, then 72. Nobody spoke. At 30 minutes, it touched 80. Her heart rate dropped to 86. The urine output monitor, which had shown almost nothing for the past hour, registered a small but measurable increase. Dr. Brooks looked up from the screen. Her eyes found Dennis across the room. At 40 minutes, Linda Grant's blood pressure read 94/61. Her heart rate was 78, steady, regular. The hormone storm was not over. It would take days to fully stabilize her, and eventually the tumor would need to be surgically removed. But the crisis had broken. The body was responding. The alpha blocker was doing what it was designed to do, and the fluids were giving her circulatory system the volume it needed to function in its newly relaxed state. Linda Grant was going to live. Dr. Price was the first to move. He walked to the whiteboard where more than a day of wrong diagnoses was still scrawled in red and blue marker, and he quietly erased his own. Dr. Wells left the room without a word. No one called after him. Richard Grant sank into the chair beside his wife's bed, took her hand, and pressed it against his forehead. His shoulders shook, but he made no sound. Dennis watched from the doorway for a moment. Then he turned and walked down the corridor, past the nurse's station, past the reception desk where he had been turned away that morning, through the double doors and back to the pediatric ward where his daughter was waiting. He did not celebrate. He did not stop to receive the thanks that a few of the doctors, the ones who had erased their own diagnoses, might have offered if he had lingered. He walked back to a small room that smelled of antiseptic and apple juice, and he sat down beside a sleeping 7-year-old, and only then, with no one watching, did he let his head drop into his hands and his shoulders shake. He was not crying for Linda Grant, a woman he had never met. He was crying for the one he had not been able to save, for the hallway 5 years ago, where he had known nothing yet and could only watch. Vanessa had died so that, one night in another hospital, a stranger would not have to. It was a terrible arithmetic, and it was the only kind of meaning the world had ever offered him for her loss, and he took it, because it was all there was. 4 days later, Linda Grant opened her eyes. The breathing tube had been removed a day and a half earlier. Her kidney function was improving. The endocrinology team had mapped the tumor on imaging, a mass a little under 3 centimeters on her left adrenal gland, and surgery was scheduled for the following week. She was weak, her voice was a thread, but she was alive and she was lucid. And when Richard told her the story of what had happened, all of it, from the 31 doctors to the man in the flannel shirt, she asked to see him. Dennis came to the suite on a Tuesday afternoon. Mia's crisis had passed 2 days earlier, and she was being discharged the following morning. He had shaved. He was wearing a clean shirt. He stood at the foot of Linda's bed with his hands at his sides, looking deeply uncomfortable in a room that was not designed for people like him. Linda studied him a long time. She was a woman who had spent 30 years reading boardrooms, measuring the worth of every person who walked through her door in the first 5 seconds. She had built an empire on the ability to see what others missed. And she had almost died because the people around her could not see past a flannel shirt and a pair of work boots. "Richard told me everything," she said. Her voice was thin but clear. "He told me what you did, and he told me what they almost did not let you do." Dennis nodded. He did not seem to know what to do with his hands. "I'm told you were a medical student once," Linda said. "A long time ago," Dennis said. "And you left because your wife died. I left because my daughter needed a father more than the world needed another doctor. Linda looked at him the way she had spent a career looking at problems, not with sentiment, but with precision. Then her expression softened into something Dennis had not expected. It was not gratitude exactly. It was recognition. The recognition of one person seeing another fully for the first time. "Thank you," she said. 2 words. No cameras, no press release, no grand gesture. Just a woman in a hospital bed, alive, because a man she never would have noticed in any other context had refused to be silent. Dennis nodded once. "I hope your recovery goes well, ma'am." Then he left the room, and he did not look back. The next morning, Dennis signed Mia's discharge papers at the pediatric station. Dolores, the nurse who had been with them since the first night, handed Mia a lollipop and told her to stay out of trouble. Mia promised she would, which they both knew was a lie. In the elevator going down, Mia tugged on Dennis's sleeve. "Daddy, where did you keep going? When I was sleeping, you kept leaving." Dennis looked down at his daughter. She had her mother's eyes, wide and brown, missing nothing. "I went to help somebody," he said. "Somebody who was very sick." "Like me?" Mia asked. "Different kind of sick, but yeah, like you." Mia thought about this. "Did you fix them?" Dennis smiled. It was the kind of smile that held more than one thing at once. Relief, exhaustion, grief, and something that might have been the beginning of peace.
"I think so, baby. I think so."
Mia reached up and took his hand, and they walked out of the hospital into the grey morning light. 3 weeks later, Dr. Sarah Brooks opened her email at the start of a night shift and found a message with the subject line, "A case for systematic screening reform." The sender was Dennis Hill. The proposal was 12 pages long, meticulously researched, and cited more than 40 peer-reviewed sources. It outlined a framework for improving detection of the tumor in emergency and critical care settings, with a particular focus on cases where the initial presentation mimicked more common conditions. It was not the work of a doctor. It was the work of a man who had lost someone and decided that the losing would mean something. Dr. Brooks read it twice. Then she forwarded it to the hospital's research committee with a single line added at the top. "This deserves to be heard. There is a particular kind of blindness that has nothing to do with the eyes." 31 brilliant people had stood around a dying woman and could not see the answer, not because it was hidden, but because the man who held it did not look the way an answer was supposed to look. He wore the wrong clothes. He came from the wrong floor. He had earned his knowledge in the worst classroom there is, a hallway outside a room where his wife was dying, and no diploma had ever certified the grief that taught him. Dennis Hill never got the white coat. He never asked for it. He only asked to be heard for the length of a few sentences by people who had already decided he had nothing to say. And in the end, the thing that saved Linda Grant's life was not the machines, or the specialists, or the marble floors of the most expensive wing in the building. It was one man who had turned his greatest loss into the only thing he had left to give, and who refused when it mattered most, to stay quiet in a room that had never wanted him there.